There are places in America that don't appear on any map worth buying. Garages at the end of gravel roads. Buildings that have been the same building for 30 years, because the people inside them decided, collectively and without discussion, that this was the place, and this was enough. Garland's garage was that kind of place. 30 men, 30 years of engine grease and hard-won loyalty, and the specific silence of people who have chosen each other so many times the choosing has become invisible, has become just the air they breathe. Nobody walked in uninvited. Nobody walked in without knocking. That was not a rule anyone had written down. It was simply the truth of the place, absorbed by everyone who had ever crossed the threshold, understood on contact, honored without exception. Until the morning a girl walked through the side door without knocking, without hesitating, without fear, and the impact wrench stopped, and 30 men went still, and nobody laughed. Not yet. Nobody knocked. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Not the girl herself, not the color of her skin against the pale overcast light pouring through the garage's side door, not even the backpack hanging off her left shoulder, like she'd been carrying it so long she'd forgotten it was there. The first thing anyone noticed was that she didn't knock, didn't hesitate at the threshold the way every single person who had ever entered Garland's garage for the past 22 years had hesitated. Didn't stand outside, with one hand raised and the other tucked into a pocket, waiting for permission. Didn't honk from the lot. Didn't call ahead. Would you treat them with kindness? Didn't do any of the things that people did when they understood, instinctively, that some spaces are not public spaces, that some doors are not meant to be walked through without acknowledgement. Would you treat them with kindness? That 30 men who spend their days with their hands inside engines and their nights doing things that don't get discussed over dinner are not the kind of men whose attention you court without preparation. She just walked in, stepped over to transmission housing lying on the concrete floor like she'd been navigating obstacle courses her entire life. Would you treat them with kindness? Looked around the garage the way you look around a room when you're not lost, when you're not confused, when you're doing the exact opposite of wandering, when you're taking inventory, measuring distances, calculating exits and entrances and who stands where relative to what. And then, over the grinding shriek of an impact wrench that Ryan Robinson was running on a 9-road King in the far bay, her voice cut through the noise like it had been designed specifically to do that. Hey, who's in charge around here? The impact wrench stopped. Not gradually. Not slowing down the way tools slow down when someone's attention drifts. It stopped immediately, like the question itself had physical weight, and it had landed directly on the trigger. 31 men in various stages of mechanical engagement, crouched under frames, bent over tanks, standing at workbenches with their hands. In places engines don't appreciate being interrupted, turned toward the sound. Some of them turned quickly. Some of them turned slowly. But every single one of them turned, because that voice carried something in it that voices in this garage did not typically carry. Not volume, not aggression, just absolute certainty. Would you treat them with kindness? The certainty of someone who has already decided where they are going to stand and is simply announcing the intention to the room. James Smith looked up from the Harley Softail he'd been leaning over for the better part of 3 hours. 62 years old, road captain for the chapter. Forearms like ship rope wrapped twice, a face that had been through enough weather, that the weathering had become its own kind of architecture. He had a socket wrench in his right hand, and an expression on his face that hadn't changed significantly in the last decade, because nothing that happened in this garage typically warranted changing it. He looked at the girl standing in the middle of his floor. Would you treat them with kindness? Then he looked at Timothy Clark, who was closest to her, and who was looking at the girl the way you look at something that materialized out of empty air, and your eyes aren't quite processing the input correctly yet. Then James looked at the transmission housing she'd stepped over like it was furniture. The heck is this? Not a question. More of an address to the universe. A request for clarification from whatever governing force was responsible for the current state of reality. She was young. Would you treat them with kindness? Young enough that James's first instinct was to check whether there was a parent somewhere in the middle distance behind her, Someone who had sent the kid in on an errand or something. Someone who would appear in the doorway in a moment and provide context. There was no parent in the doorway. There was no one with kindness. There was no one behind her at all. Just the gray Tennessee morning and the sound of traffic from the road a quarter mile off, and the particular quality of light that comes through corrugated metal siding in mid-October when the sun hasn't committed to anything yet. 18 maybe. Skin the color of dark polished wood. Natural hair pulled back into something that had been a deliberate style about 6 hours ago and had since arrived at a kind of beautiful chaos curls, escaping the tie and framing her face in a way she clearly didn't care about because she hadn't touched it once since walking in, and people who care about their hair touch it. Constantly. Reflexively. She was not touching it. She was looking around the garage with those inventory-taking eyes and waiting for an answer to a question that 30 men were apparently processing too slowly for her satisfaction. Because, she said it again. I'm not trying to be rude. Her voice hadn't changed. Still the same register. Still the same precise quality. Like every word had been allotted its exact necessary space and no more. I just need to know who to talk to. The jacket she was wearing had been blue once. Deep blue, the kind of denim that takes years of washing and wearing to bleach into something softer. It was 2 sizes too large for her frame, hanging off her shoulders in a way that suggested it had been designed for someone else's body, entirely broader, taller, built along different lines. The cuffs reached past her wrist bones. The hem fell somewhere past her hips. Under it, a plain white shirt. Jeans with a paint stain on the left knee that was white and matte. The kind of mark that comes from a wall, not from a workbench. Not engine grease, not transmission fluid. Paint. The actual house wall kind. And on her feet, canvas sneakers worn down to the point where the structural integrity of the toe box was largely theoretical. She was carrying a backpack on her left shoulder, single-strapped, and in her right hand, loose at her side, she held a folded portfolio case. The clear-sleeved kind that art students carry, that painters carry, that people who have accumulated enough visual work to need a portable display system carry. James set down his socket wrench. He straightened up, and when James Smith straightened up to his full height, would you treat them with kindness? Something in the air pressure of the garage changed slightly, because he was 6'2" and broad across the back, and had been in this building long enough that the building had somewhat arranged itself around his presence. Would you treat them with kindness? And grown men who knew him well, and had ridden with him for years, had a tendency when he straightened up like that, to take an involuntary step backward. It was not something they did consciously. It was something their nervous systems did independently, a kind of biometric response to available data. The girl did not step backward. She stood exactly where she had been standing, one hand holding the portfolio, the other loosely at her side, and she looked at him with an expression that was not bravado. Bravado has a performance quality to it, a self-consciousness. This was something quieter and considerably more unsettling, which was simply the absence of fear. Not the suppression of it. The absence. Like fear had been an option she'd considered and categorically declined some time ago and hadn't revisited since. You walked into a private garage, James said. He kept his voice at its working register. The one he used when he was conveying information rather than making a threat. Because 30 years of road captaining had taught him the difference between situations that required escalation and situations that required diagnosis. And this was as yet unclear. So let's start there. How'd you find this place? Simple. No embellishment. Word. He repeated it the way you repeat a word when you're deciding whether it's going to be funny or whether it's going to be a problem. What word, specifically? That this is the chapter garage, she said. She shifted the backpack slightly on her shoulder, not nervously. The way people adjust things when they're uncomfortable, but the way people make small ergonomic corrections when they're getting comfortable, when they're settling in. And that if you want real custom work in this part of the state, this is where the real conversations happen. Somewhere in the back bay, Ryan Robinson, probably, or possibly Kenneth Lee, a short sound escaped. Not quite a laugh. Not quite its opposite. Something in the register of surprised amusement that hadn't decided what it was going to be yet. Real work. James let the phrase sit for a moment. I paint. She said it the way people state facts that don't require elaboration because the facts are self-evident. Custom work. Murals. Gas tanks. Fenders. I don't use stencils, I don't trace, I don't do transfers or digital projection. Everything freehand. I'm fast and I'm good and I'll work for tips until you decide you want to keep me on a regular arrangement. A pause, one beat. My name's Vanessa. Vanessa Carter. The garage was quiet for a moment, that stretched 3 seconds longer than quiet usually stretches, which is 3 seconds longer than most people are comfortable with, and which Vanessa Carter apparently found perfectly acceptable, because she filled none of it. She stood in it the way you stand in weather, letting it be what it was, not trying to fix it. Then James Smith laughed. Not the performative kind, not the dismissive kind either. The genuine kind, the deep shoulder-moving variety, that comes when something surprises you so completely that your body decides laughter is the only appropriate pressure release. And once James laughed, it spread the way things spread in enclosed spaces, because Timothy Clark started, and then Daniel Lopez at the back bench, and within 10 seconds a significant portion of the garage was laughing, not unkindly, not with any specific cruelty in it, just the way men laugh when the gap between expectation and reality has become so wide that laughter is the only bridge available. Vanessa Carter stood in the middle of it and waited. She didn't smile along, the way people smile along when they want to be included in the joke, even if they're the joke. She didn't look embarrassed, didn't look hurt, didn't look away. She just waited, with her portfolio in her hand, and her inventory-taking eyes moving slowly around the room, and the patience of someone who has discovered that most things, if you wait them out, resolve themselves eventually. When it died down, James wiped his eye with the back of his wrist and looked at her again. Something in his expression had shifted, not softened exactly, recalibrated. "Kid," he said, and he said it not with condescension but with something closer to a kind of rough acknowledgement. "You've got some nerve walking in here and saying that. I'm not a kid. No heat in it. Just a correction. You're what, 18? 18? She didn't add anything. Didn't qualify it. "I've been painting since I was 9, she said. "I've done work for shops in Nashville and Knoxville. I'm not asking for charity and I'm not asking you to take my word for it." She nodded toward the far wall, where 2 finished tanks were hanging display pieces, or waiting for pickup, or both. "I can see 2 pieces from here. The work is decent, it isn't exceptional. I'm exceptional." The laughing had stopped entirely. The garage had shifted into a different register of quiet, not the surprised quiet from when she'd first walked in, but the attentive kind, the kind where people aren't just registering that something is happening, but are actually listening for what comes next. Timothy Clark tilted his head. James studied her face, and Timothy said, with genuine curiosity rather than challenge, "You always walk into places and tell people their work isn't exceptional." "Only when it isn't," Vanessa said, "and only when I can do better." She pulled the backpack off her shoulder, set it down without drama, unzipped the main compartment, and produced the portfolio case she'd been carrying. The clear-sleeved kind, well used, the corners slightly worn. She held it out in Timothy's direction, not begging him to take it, offering it with the confidence of someone who already knows what's inside and what the response is going to be. Timothy looked at James. James made a small gesture with his hand. So Timothy took the portfolio. He opened it, looked at the first page, didn't say anything, turned to the second page, the third, and somewhere around the 4th page, Timothy Clark had walked 3 steps toward the overhead light without appearing to have made a decision to do so. Feet had just moved, drawn by some instinct that his conscious mind hadn't caught up with yet, seeking better illumination for something his eyes wanted more of. "James." He said it without looking up from the portfolio. "I'm busy." James was, in fact, looking directly at Timothy and the portfolio and had not moved toward the softail. "James." The second time was different. "Would you treat them with kindness? The way a person's voice changes when what they're looking at has knocked loose something they weren't expecting, a quality of needing a second witness." James walked over, looked at the portfolio over Timothy's shoulder. There was the kind of silence that happens when the person doing the looking, doesn't have language immediately available for what they're seeing. A wolf in mid-howl that occupied an entire tank and gave the impression of motion despite being a fixed image on curved metal, the fur moving, the jaw working. Would you treat them with kindness? The eyes carrying something that was not the flat, reflective quality of painted eyes, but something that suggested the animal was aware of being observed and had formed an opinion about it. Eagles would treat them with kindness. Eagles with individual feathers, each one a slightly different value, catching light from a source you couldn't see, but could somehow feel the direction of. Flames that had weight and trajectory. And heat, not the decorative shorthand for fire that appeared on 100 tanks in 100 shops, but actual combustion. Actual physics rendered in paint on metal with a brush held by a human hand. And threaded them with kindness. And threaded through everything. Were confident past the point of confidence into the territory of inevitability, as though the images had been there waiting under the surface, and the painter had simply been the instrument of their emergence. How old were you when you did this one? James asked. He was pointing at the wolf piece. His voice had changed, not dramatically. Just enough. 15. 15. I know, she said. He looked at the portfolio for another long moment. Then he closed it, handed it back to Timothy, and looked at Vanessa with kindness, and looked at Vanessa that was conducting several things simultaneously: assessment, calculation, something older and less easily named that moved through his eyes like weather. Where'd you learn? He said. And something happened to Vanessa Carter's face. It lasted less than a second. A flicker the way a candle moves when a door opens somewhere else in the house, when a draft reaches it from a room away. Something crossed her expression that wasn't any of the things she'd been displaying since she'd walked in. Not composure, not the measuring quality, not the refusal of fear. Something older than any of those things. Something that had been settled for long enough that it had stopped being acute and had become simply part of the architecture, the way grief becomes after enough time passes, not gone, but load-bearing, structural, present in every part of the building without announcing itself. My brother, she said. He taught me. Your brother's a painter? James asked. The pause was 1 second longer than it should have been, just one. But in a garage that had gone this quiet, 1 second registered like a measure of music. He was, she said. Nobody said anything. James Smith had spent over 2 decades reading rooms and reading people, had developed over those years a fluency in the language of what people are not saying, the grammar of what they hold back and why and how much it costs them to hold it. He looked at this girl's face now, past the composure, past the oversized jacket, past the worn sneakers and the portfolio case, and he saw someone carrying something, not performing weight, actually under it. The particular stillness of a person who has been moving fast enough and long enough that stillness is not rest but simply the absence of forward motion. Look, he said, I'm not going to throw you out, but I can't hand you a bike on your word and a portfolio. I know. Still steady. I'm not asking you to. Give me a tank, whatever you've got sitting around that you haven't started. Give me 2 hours and see what I do with it. James looked at her for a long moment. You'll work for tips, he said. Until you decide, she said. Another pause. James looked at Timothy. Timothy gave him the smallest shrug in the world, the one that in their private vocabulary meant not I don't hate the idea, but rather something closer to I genuinely cannot tell you. This is wrong. What do you say your brother's name was? James asked. I didn't, Vanessa said, and something moved in her expression briefly before she continued. But it was Darnell Cooper. The socket wrench that Ryan Robinson had been holding for the past 3 minutes hit the concrete floor with a sound like a gunshot. Nobody laughed. James Smith's entire body went the particular kind of still that bodies go when the nervous system receives information it needs a moment to process, not surprise. Exactly, because surprise implies the information is implausible. And this wasn't implausible, it was just enormous. Enormous in a specific way that had specific weight and specific history and a specific name when something long absent suddenly has shape again, suddenly has a face in a garage doorway with worn sneakers and a portfolio case and an oversized jacket that has been oversized for reasons that are now becoming apparent. He stared at Vanessa Carter. really stared. Past the treat them with kindness. Past the inventory-taking eyes, past the composure, past all the things she'd been doing since she walked in that had impressed him in their way. And he looked at her face the way you look at something when you're searching for confirmation of something you already suspect. The jaw, the set of the eyes, the quality of patience in the way she held herself while waiting. He found it. "Darnell Cooper," James said. His voice was careful now, measuring its own weight before placing it. "Yes, you're Darnell Cooper's sister. Not a question anymore. Younger sister," she said. "By 6 years. He used to call me Sky because he said Vanessa was too formal for someone who climbed on the roof to paint the rain gutters." Something moved across her face, then quick, like a shadow crossing water, and for the fraction of a second. Before it was gone, it looked like the very beginning of a smile, the ghost of one, the memory of one, and then it was gone. "He taught me everything he knew about painting before She stopped, cleared her throat. Before. George White walked in from the back room at that moment. George White, 68 years old. The oldest active member of the chapter. The one who had been riding since before half the men in this building were in school. The one whose history, with this organization, went back far enough that some of it had become legend and some of it George himself no longer talked about. He was carrying a coffee mug, and he stopped 2 steps inside the door when he registered the quality of the silence, that particular silence. The one that has texture and temperature and weight, the one that means something has happened here that has changed the air of the room. And he looked at James and then at the girl and said, in his measured way, "What's going on?" "Her name is Vanessa Carter," James said. "She's Darnell Cooper's younger sister." George White lowered his coffee mug very slowly. He set it on a nearby shelf with the deliberate care of a man who doesn't trust his hands with it, who needs both of them free and occupied with something else. He walked toward Vanessa with the measured slowness of someone who is working very carefully to ensure that his face is doing exactly and only what he wants it to do, which is a kind of labor that takes concentration, and his concentration was almost fully visible. He stopped in front of her. He was 68 years old, with a gray beard and hands that told their own history, and eyes that, when he looked at Vanessa Carter, were complicated in a way that even he probably could not have named, carrying things in them that had been there for 4 years, and that he had not expected to find a place to put down today. "Show me your left arm," he said quietly. Vanessa looked at him for a moment. Just a moment. Then she pushed up the left sleeve of the oversized denim jacket and held out her forearm. On the inside of her wrist, small and deliberate and clearly done with care, a tattoo, a wrench and a paintbrush crossed, and below it, in script small enough that you had to be standing this close to read it, "DC taught me to see." George looked at it for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at her face. "He talked about you," George said. "Quite a lot. He called you the stubborn one." His voice had the quality of something that has been kept somewhere and is now being brought into light, carefully, like it's fragile. "Would you treat them with kindness?" And Vanessa Carter's composure did something that it had refused to since she'd walked through the side door of Garland's garage. It didn't break. It didn't collapse. But it developed a hairline crack at the edges, something in the corners of her mouth, something in the quality of her eyes, just enough to show what was underneath it, which was not weakness, but something considerably more complex than strength. "He called everybody the stubborn ones," she said. Her voice was working to hold its register, its steadiness, the flat, practiced certainty of a person who has been delivering difficult information about themselves to new people for a long time, and has developed a technique for it. That was his thing. Everyone else was stubborn. He was just right. George made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite the other thing it was adjacent to. He reached out and placed one large, weathered hand on her shoulder gently, with the care of someone handling something that matters more than he expected it to when he walked into this room this morning and squeezed once. "How long have you been on your own?" he asked. "Long enough." "How long?" Not softer, but quieter. The distinction mattered. She looked at the floor. Just for a moment. One breath. 14 months, she said. "Since I turned 18. The garage was completely still. 28 men who made their living in noise engines, tools, metal on metal, the radio in the back bay that had been playing something classic and low since 7 in the morning, standing in silence. Not performing silence. In it. Because what had just been said landed in the room with the specific weight of a fact that changes the character of everything you've already been looking at. 14 months. 18. The math of that, the timeline of it, the image of a person this young, moving through a year and 2 months of American geography, with a backpack and a portfolio case and a jacket that was not her size. "Where have you been staying?" George asked. "Here and there," the practiced answer. The one that had been through many iterations and arrived at this particular formulation because it was true and could not be challenged and communicated exactly the amount of information she intended to communicate. "Are you safe?" James asked from behind George. His voice had changed. Still measured. Still the road captain's voice. But carrying something now that road captain voices don't always carry. "I'm fine," Vanessa said. Then, more precisely, "I'm not here for that. I'm not here because I need to be rescued." She raised her head and looked at James directly, and the composure was back, locked in, rebuilt in the 3 seconds, while she'd been looking at the floor, though George was close enough to see that her jaw was carrying the effort of it. "I am genuinely here because I can paint and because." A stop. A restart. Darnell used to talk about this place, about the people here. And when things got to a point where I needed somewhere to land, another stop. She exhaled, something controlled, deliberate. "I thought maybe someone here would know who I was. That's all. I thought maybe someone would know who I was." The specificity of that, the particular human ache of it, not needing to be saved, not asking for just asking to be recognized, to walk into a room where your name means something, where your history has a shape that someone else has already encountered, where you don't have to explain from the beginning what and who and why. Just recognized. George White looked at her for a long time. Then he turned and looked at James Smith. James was a man with a policy about strays. The policy was simple and unambiguous, and had been tested through many situations that were designed, it sometimes seemed, specifically to find its limits. He had held it because it was the right policy, because the chapter had obligations and structures and histories that didn't accommodate sentimentality, because every time he deviated from it, there had been complications that confirmed the deviation was a mistake. He had held it. He was a man of held positions. He looked at Vanessa Carter's face, the jaw, the tattoo on the inside of her wrist that said DC taught me to see, the oversized jacket, the worn sneakers, the portfolio case. Then he conducted a very brief internal argument with the policy. The argument was not long, because the argument did not have a strong position to defend. "Get a tank," James said. He looked across the room at Daniel Lopez, one of the diner shells in the back that we haven't prepped. He looked at Vanessa. "You've got 2 hours. Use whatever's in the supply cabinet." He paused. "If what you put on that tank matches what was in that portfolio, we talk." Another pause. "And somebody get this girl a coffee. I don't need." Vanessa started. "That wasn't an offer," James said, and he picked up his socket wrench and turned back toward the Softail. "It was a test. Let's see if you can accept something without arguing about it." A beat. 4 seconds. The kind of silence that has a decision happening in it. "I'll take the coffee," Vanessa said. "Good," James said. And he did not look up from the Softail, and nobody saw his expression, which was possibly deliberate. Daniel Lopez went to get the tank. Kenneth Lee went to get the coffee. The garage began to resume its sounds, not all at once. Not the sudden return of noise like a switch being thrown, but gradually, piece by piece. The ordinary them with kindness, the ordinary machinery of the place knitting itself back together the way things do after a moment that's altered something. Wrenches finding their purpose again. Engines receiving attention. The radio in the back coming up to its usual volume. The specific industrial soundtrack of people who know what they're doing it. But underneath it, threaded through the familiar noise like a wire that hadn't been there before morning, was something else. An awareness. Would you treat them with kindness? The knowledge that Darnell Cooper's younger sister was standing at a workbench in the chapter garage setting up her equipment, and that every man in this building was watching her, without appearing to watch her. Would you treat them with kindness, in the way that you keep track of something significant without wanting to be seen keeping track? Would you treat them with kindness? She set the coffee down on the edge of the workbench, not ignoring it, but putting it somewhere as accessible for later. The way you put things when you have work to do and the work comes first. Would you treat them with kindness? Then she took the backpack off her shoulder, set it on the stool beside the bench, and unzipped a secondary compartment that turned out to hold a zippered case about the length of her forearm. When she opened it, the interior was precisely organized brushes of different sizes and configurations, each in its designated slot, each handle clean, each ferrule without excess paint, labeled in her own small handwriting with the type and size. Would you treat them with kindness? The organization stood in deliberate contrast to everything else about her appearance, which suggested a person who had not been living in circumstances that permitted many luxuries but had protected these tools with an intention bordering on the categorical. Would you treat them with kindness? She ran her finger along the handles the way a person does, accounting for what's there, checking inventory, confirming that the things they need are where they left them. The way a musician checks strings before a performance, not because they don't trust themselves, but because the ritual of checking is part of the ritual of beginning, and the ritual of beginning is how you tell yourself that the work is real and you are ready for it. Daniel Lopez came back with the raw Dynatank and set it on the workbench without ceremony. Bare metal. No primer, no preliminary treatment, just the tank. Scratch-free and blank, every surface available. Vanessa looked at it. The way she looked at it was the way some people look at blank surfaces and see potential, and some people look at blank surfaces and see work, but neither of those was quite the thing she was doing. She looked at it the way you look at something that is not empty, that is full of everything that hasn't been uncovered yet, full of the image that is already there and only needs to be found, and she was a person who knew how to find it. She picked up a brush. The garage watched. She did not sketch first, did not mark anything out in pencil or chalk, did not make any preliminary reference points, did not do any of the things that painters do when they are working out a composition before committing to it. She simply chose a brush, held it for a moment, in a way that suggested she was feeling the balance of it, and then she started. One line. Would you treat them with kindness? Coming up from the lower curve of the tank, clean and decisive, a single stroke that moved with the confidence of someone who already knows where it ends before the brush gets there. James, who was not watching, found himself watching 20 seconds after the stroke had been made. He looked back at the softail. He looked back at Vanessa 30 seconds later. The line had become the spine of something. A shape was emerging with keystus, emerging from the metal surface that he couldn't yet identify but that he could already feel in the way that visual intelligence works, the way the eye knows before the mind has the language for knowing. There was something about the quality of it that was exactly like the portfolio and also exactly like something else, something older that lived in a different part of his memory, in a room of his memory he didn't open often because the opening cost something. He set down the socket wrench for the second time, walked to the workbench, stood behind Vanessa Carter, and looked at what was taking shape on the bare metal surface. The garage went quiet again, not all at once, but piece by piece, the way silence assembles when something is pulling people's attention in one direction, when the specific gravity of what's happening somewhere in the room begins to exceed the specific gravity of what everyone else is doing. "What is that?" James said quietly, not intrusively. The way you ask when you can see it's going somewhere and you want the information without interrupting the direction. Vanessa didn't stop the brush. "The Cooper family emblem," she said, the same quality in her voice that had been there since she walked in, flat and certain and precise. But underneath it, something different now, something that was not performance. "Darnell designed it. I've never put it on anything before today." A pause, just a breath's worth. It felt like it belonged here. James looked at the shape on the tank. He recognized it. He had seen it exactly once before. 4 years and several lifetimes ago, a rough sketch on the back of a meeting agenda. A man at the end of a long table working through something with a pen during a discussion about something else entirely, and then stopping to hold it up and explain it to George and two other men who were paying attention. His voice had a quality to it that Darnell Cooper's voice sometimes had, the quality of making something sound simultaneously simple and vast. It's going to be the thing that means us. All of us. Where we come from. What we're made of. He'd never finished it. He had disappeared before he got it onto anything that mattered. Did Darnell ever tell you about this? James asked. He kept his voice careful, even, watching. He showed me the sketch when I was 12, Vanessa said. The brush kept moving another line now, and another, the shape clarifying itself, resolving from abstraction into something with identity, with specific weight. He said someday he'd put it on something that deserved it. A pause. He never got to. The garage was completely silent. 28 men. Not one of them making a sound. The radio in the back had been turned down at some point, by someone, without announcement. Outside, a truck went by on the road a quarter-mile off, and the vibration of it traveled briefly through the concrete floor and then was gone. And the silence returned, and in that silence Vanessa Carter painted, with a kindness, with a quality in her hand that was impossible to look away from the certainty of it, the absolute absence of hesitation in every stroke, the sense that each mark she made was not a decision but a recognition. James took 2 steps back from the workbench. Stood there. George White had come in from wherever he'd been in the back, and was standing in the doorway to the rear room, coffee forgotten somewhere, watching. Ryan Robinson had picked up his socket wrench from the floor at some point but wasn't using it. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. For the duration of 2 full minutes, that felt architectural, like they were holding something up. The chapter, Garage, watched Darnell Cooper's little sister paint a thing her brother had designed 12 years ago and never finished, and the image on the metal grew clearer and more inevitable. With every passing second, and every man in the room was doing the same thing simultaneously. The private, specific math of grief that involves looking at something present and seeing something absent, and finding in that equation something they hadn't expected to find, which was not resolution. Grief doesn't resolve but something adjacent to it. The strange and particular relief of being reminded that what was lost was real, was specific, was a man who had a sister who climbed on roofs and painted rain gutters, and remembered every sketch he'd ever shown her, and had been carrying it for 6 years against a day she didn't know was coming but that had arrived now, in this building, in this room, on a Tuesday in October with 30 men watching. The tank was done in 1 hour and 47 minutes. Not 2 hours. 1 hour and 47 minutes. Vanessa set the brush down on the workbench and stepped back and crossed her arms and looked at what she'd made and said nothing. She didn't announce that she was finished. She didn't call attention to it. She just stepped back and waited, the way she'd been waiting since she walked in the door. Would you treat them with kindness? It was Timothy Clark who noticed first, because Timothy had been watching the way you watch something that you can't explain and aren't ready to stop looking at, standing with his forearms on the frame of the bike he was pretending to work on, and his eyes moving between his hands and the workbench in a rhythm that had been going on for the better part of an hour. He straightened up, walked over, stood in front of the tank. He didn't say anything for a full 10 seconds. James, his voice was quiet, not alarmed. Something else. I'm busy. James was already walking over. The Cooper family emblem. Complete. A pair of wings, not the generic decorative shorthand that appeared on 1,000 custom pieces in 1,000 different shops. Not the eagle shorthand, or the angel shorthand, or the biker shorthand, but something specific and architectural, wings with individual feathers, each one laid down with its own shadow, its own light source, its own direction, each one a component of something larger that somehow retained its individual integrity. Inside the wings, a road, vanishing into the middle distance where horizon and sky became the same thing. And on that road, faint as a memory, 2 figures on bikes, one larger, one smaller, one slightly ahead, one slightly behind, not following, not lagging, but the precise distance of someone riding with someone as opposed to riding after them. And below it all, in script that was so clean and controlled it could have been typeset, but absolutely was not. 4 words, what the road gives. James looked at the script, looked at the wings, looked at the 2 figures. That's Darnell's phrase, he said quietly, stating a fact as it landed. He used to say it every time he came back from a run, Vanessa said. Her voice was careful in a new way. Her voice was the way you are when you're handling something that has been yours alone for a long time, and you're sharing it with the first people who have any claim to it alongside you. What the road gives you keep. What the road takes, you earn back. A pause. I thought about leaving the words off, but it felt like erasing him. Nobody in the garage was making a sound. 17 men. The radio had been off for some time. Would you treat them with kindness? The afternoon light through the corrugated siding was doing what afternoon light does in October in Tennessee, which is to come in at an angle that makes everything look more serious than it usually looks. Would you treat them with kindness that gives ordinary things the quality of objects in a painting where you can tell the painter knew something about time? George White came and stood beside James. Looked at the tank. His jaw was working slightly, the way a jaw works when the person it belongs to has made a decision that they are not going to let their face show what it's doing, and is having to actively maintain that decision against some pressure. Son of a gun, George said softly. Just that. 2 words. James turned around and looked at the room, at faces he'd known for 10, 15, 20 years. Would you treat them with kindness? Men who had been here when Darnell Cooper was here, who had stood at this man's shoulder and ridden in his wake, and attended the things you attend when someone disappears, and you don't know enough to hold a funeral, but you know enough to know that the absence is permanent. Would you treat them with kindness? He saw in their faces the same complicated thing that George's jaw was working through, the thing that lives between grief and wonder, between the past and the present, between the loss of something and the discovery that the loss was not as total as you'd believed. He looked at Vanessa Carter. Who else have you shown that emblem to? He said. Nobody. Simple. Certain. You never painted it before today. No. Why today? Would you treat them with kindness? She met his eyes directly, without deflection, without the performer's relationship with being watched that some people have when they know the answer is significant. Just met his eyes. The way you meet someone's eyes when what you're about to say is the truth, and the truth doesn't require staging. Because today was the first time I found somewhere that deserved it. The silence held for 2 seconds. 3. Long enough to have weight. Then James Smith nodded once. Short. Decisive. The nod of a man filing something into the correct category after careful consideration. You're on, he said. Tips for the first week. We talk after. He turned back to the room. Somebody get her set up at the second bench. Move whatever's there. Daniel Lopez moved his things from the second bench without a word. No argument, no negotiation, no performance of reluctance. Actually, genuinely, with something in his movement that Ryan Robinson noticed and gave him a look about, an expression that said, what's happening here? And Daniel just made a small shrug that said exactly what it said. Timothy Clark said, matter-of-factly, not performing sentiment, just delivering information. Darnell used to work that bench. Left side, second from the window. Every time. Vanessa looked at the bench. Something moved through her face quick, the way shadows move, there and then not there. She looked at the hinge where the second bench met the wall, looked at the window above it, the afternoon light coming in at its October angle. I know, she said. He told me. She picked up her brush case, walked to the bench, set it down. And the gear clicked, the way gears click, the way things settle when they've found the arrangement they were always going to find. Would you treat them with kindness? The new arrangement landing into place with the particular rightness of something that took a long time to arrive and arrived exactly when it was supposed to, and announced itself simply, without fanfare, by being present. Benignness. Vanessa Carter stood at the second bench from the window in her brother's garage with her brother's case and her brother's instruments, in a building full of her brother's people, and she opened her case. Would you treat them with kindness? And she ran her finger along the handles one more time in the ritual of accounting, and the garage moved around her, back into its ordinary business of noise and work people, and the specific industry of people who have found what they're good at, and spend their days doing it? Would you treat them with kindness? But there was a thread underneath the ordinary noise that hadn't been there this morning, running through everything. Would you treat them with kindness? Invisible and structural, the way certain things are structural, present in every part of the building without announcing themselves, doing the load-bearing work quietly, holding something up. Darnell Cooper's little sister was at the second bench from the window. Every man in the room knew it. Every man in the room would carry it differently. Some would think about it on the drive home. Some would call someone they hadn't called in a while. Some would you treat them with kindness, would look at the Cooper family emblem drying on the Dyna tank and find in the two figures something they needed to find, the particular human need to know that what mattered to you is being carried forward by someone, that the things you valued are still in the world in some form, that value doesn't simply end when the person carrying it disappears. Vanessa picked up a brush. The October light came through the window above the second bench and found her hands and them visible in the way that light in this room at this hour, on this particular Thursday, had apparently been waiting all day to do. She began. She was there at 7:15. The garage didn't open until 7:30, which was not a hard rule but was a soft understanding. The kind of understanding that develops in a place over years, the way sediment develops in still water slowly, invisibly, until it's just the floor of the thing, and you don't remember when it wasn't there. 7:30 was when James arrived. When James arrived, the day began. That was the shape of it. Had been for 11 years. Vanessa Carter arrived at 7:15. Not because she was making a point. Or maybe she was, but not the kind of point that requires an audience. Not the performed kind. More like the kind of point a person makes to themselves, the private declaration of someone who has spent 14 months in a state of provisional everything fashion, provisional shelter, provisional employment, provisional identity in each new place, and has found, for the first time in 14 months, somewhere they intend to be permanent about. 7:15 is not an accident. 7:15 is someone who set an alarm. She'd brought coffee. Not just for herself. 6 paper cups in a cardboard carrier, set on the center work table without announcement or explanation or any indication that she expected acknowledgement. She put them there, and she walked to the second bench from the window, and she opened her case, and she started her day. Would you treat them with kindness? And the men who arrived and noticed the coffee and took a cup without looking at her were doing the same thing she was doing, conducting a transaction in a language that doesn't use words, the language of spaces that have their own grammar and their own protocols, and where the right move is frequently the move that requires the least ceremony. 3 men took cups. None of them said anything, which was exactly right. Ryan Robinson came in at 7:42. Which was 8 minutes after James had arrived, and 12 minutes after. He'd noticed the 6 cups on the center table and processed, without comment, what they meant. Ryan did a sweep of the lot on his way, in every morning old instinct, the kind you maintain without examining the reason for maintaining it, because the reason is the kind of thing that gets examined during quiet moments, and quiet moments have a way of being uncomfortable. He came through the side door, and before he said anything else, he said, "Gray Accord across the street. Same one as yesterday. Parked before I pulled in." James didn't look up from the transmission he was diagnosing. How long? Car was there when I got here. So at least since 7. It was 7:42. The number settled in the room. Someone had been sitting in a gray Accord across from the garage for at least 42 minutes, possibly longer, watching the door. This was not, in the world these men occupied, an unusual category of occurrence. It was, however, an occurrence with a specific taxonomy, certain kinds of watchers, certain kinds of reasons, and everyone in the room was quietly performing that taxonomy. Vanessa's brush stopped moving. Not dramatically. Not with any visible physical response. Just 2 seconds of stillness, and then it was moving again. The same controlled pressure against the metal surface of the Road King tank she'd started the previous afternoon. The same quality of attention in her hand, but something had changed in the way she was holding her shoulders. James noticed. "His name is Jason Ramirez," Vanessa said, without turning around. Her voice had the particular flatness of a person reading from a document they've memorized. He's a private investigator. He's been following me for about 3 months. Not continuously. He picks me up, loses me when I move, picks me up again when I make a mistake. She paused. He's good. Better than the last one Nicole hired. The room was paying attention now. Nicole Torres is my aunt, Vanessa continued. Still not turning around. Still working the tank, as if the conversation were incidental to what her hands were doing rather than the reverse. My mother's older sister. When Darnell disappeared 4 years ago, and my mother had her breakdown and went into residential care, Nicole decided that being my mother's legal representative also meant being my legal representative. I was 15 then. She might have had an argument at 15. She set the brush down, turned around. Her face was controlled and kindness. Her face was controlled and precise. But there was something moving underneath the precision, not fear, which would have been simpler, but the specific exhaustion of someone who has been running an argument in their head for 14 months and knows every line of it by heart. I'm 18. She doesn't have an argument anymore, but she's still making it. James looked at her for a moment. What does she want? She wants me under her roof, under her supervision, under her legal authority. Vanessa picked the brush back up, turned back to the tank. She also wants Darnell's estate. That's the part that matters to her in practical terms. I'm the mechanism. If she has legal custody of me, or something that functions like it, she has standing in the estate proceedings. If I'm just a legal adult living independently, she has nothing. George White had appeared at some point in the last 30 seconds in the doorway to the back room. He was listening with the stillness of someone who has been listening to important things for 68 years. And knows how to do it with his whole body. She filed a petition, Vanessa said. I don't know all the specific legal language. What I know is that every time Ramirez finds me, I have to move. She paused. Something shifted in her voice, not breaking but adjusting, like a structure taking on new load. 6 times in 14 months. This is the 7th place. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then, I'm sorry, Vanessa said. I wasn't going to tell you today. I thought if I could just establish something first, show I was working, show I had a place, it would be different. It would be stronger, legally. She stopped. I thought if I could just get it established somewhere. She didn't finish. Didn't need to. The grammar of the unfinished sentence was clear enough. She thought, if she could just get it established somewhere, then she could stay. Then the running could stop. Then the taxonomy of provisional everything could close, and something permanent could open. And she'd picked here. Not randomly. With the specific intelligence of someone who understood the variables, and chose the arrangement most likely to hold. The side door opened. Not the way Vanessa had opened it the previous morning, not the deliberate, unhesitating entrance of someone who has made a decision and is executing it. This was a different kind of opening. Careful. Checking. A head appeared first, mid-40s. Side-parted hair the color of old sand. Clean-shaved. A khaki jacket. The face of a man who has learned to read rooms quickly, and is reading this one now and finding the data significantly less comfortable than he'd hoped. Jason Ramirez. Because of course it was. He stepped through the door and stood just inside it, which was 2 steps inside it, which was 2 steps too far. He had a file folder under one arm, not the casual kind, the thick kind, the kind with a clasp and a history, and his eyes moved around the garage in the practiced way of a man who does this for a living, cataloging faces and exits, and the general disposition of the room, and they stopped when they reached Vanessa. Just for a second. Just long enough. Vanessa had already turned her back to him. Deliberately. Her hands were on the workbench, brush in the right, steadying herself with the left, and she was looking at the tank, and not at the man who'd been sitting outside her current location for 42 minutes in a gray Accord. I'm looking for Ramirez began. We're closed, James said without looking up from the transmission. The working register. The one that conveyed information rather than threats, but conveyed it with a density that left very little interpretive space. Right. I can see that the Ramirez adjusted. I was told this is Garland's. I'm a private investigator, Jason Ramirez, and I have reason to believe that I said it's closed. James set down his tool and turned around, And when James Smith turned around and gave someone his full attention, it was a specific experience, the kind that people who've had it tend to remember with a clarity that suggests their nervous system filed it somewhere important. That means whatever you're looking for, you're not going to find it here. Ramirez looked at James. He was smart enough, professional enough to understand what he was seeing and do the math. He recalculated, visibly, the way a chess player recalculates when a piece they hadn't properly assessed reveals its range. I have documentation, he said. I'm not here to cause problems. I'm looking for a minor in potential need of. She's 18, James said. And there are no minors here. The way he said it was interesting. She's 18. Present tense. Referring to a specific person in the room. Not a hypothetical. Not a general statement. He'd said it before Ramirez had named anyone. And Ramirez heard that and processed what it meant about how much this room already knew. The party I represent has legal interest in her whereabouts as of, James asked. I'm a private investigator. Right. Not a badge. James's voice had not changed register, did not need to. Private investigators don't have authority to enter private property and demand information. You know that. I know that. So you can turn around and leave, or we can call someone who knows it in more technical language and have a much longer morning. Your choice. About 4 seconds. Ramirez stood there for a moment that cost him something. His eyes went one more time toward the back of the room, toward the second bench from the window, where Vanessa Carter was very, very still, both hands on the workbench, not moving. I'll leave my card, he said. Don't bother, James said. Ramirez left. The door closed. The hydraulic arm brought it back slowly, the way it always did. The ordinary mechanical patience of a thing that closes at the same speed, regardless of what preceded the closing. The garage held its breath. Not literally, but in the way spaces hold it, a collective suspension, a pause in the ordinary processing of things, while the room realigns to a new configuration of facts. Then James, without turning around from the transmission, Vanessa. I heard, she said. You want to tell me what that was? She turned around then, and her face had with kindness, and her face had something in it that her face had been refusing to have since yesterday morning, not the composure cracking, because the composure was still there, still doing its work, but the work was visible now. The effort of it was visible, the way the structure of effort shows when the load on it increases past a certain point. He's been finding me every 3 to 4 weeks on average, she said. The gap gets shorter when Nicole increases what she's paying him. A pause. The way he finds me is credit cards. Any card transaction in a town, he knows within 48 hours. I've been using cash when I can, but cash runs out. And when it runs out, I use a card once, and inside a week, he knows the area. She looked at James steadily. Gas station. 2 towns over. 3 days ago. $22. Brought him straight to the county. The specific smallness of it. $22. The math of being found. I'm sorry, she said again. I didn't want to bring this to your door. I thought I had more time before he... Stop apologizing, James said. The edge in his voice wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the situation, at the door that had just closed, at the 42 minutes in the gray Accord, at the entire architecture of that been following a young woman from place to place for over a year, because an older woman wanted access to a dead man's estate and had found the most efficient legal mechanism to pursue it. That's not yours to apologize for. George had come fully into the main room by now. His arms were crossed, and his expression was doing the thing it did when he was processing something through multiple layers simultaneously. Me, the surface layer, and the historical layer, and the layer underneath that where he kept the things he'd seen, and the things he'd lost, and the math of how they related to the present. How much does she actually want? George asked. Nicole. Past the legal language. Vanessa looked at him. And here was the moment visible, specific, the moment when someone who has been maintaining a controlled distance from a truth decides to put the truth down on a surface where other people can see it. Darnell had assets, she said. More than I knew until recently. Property mainly. A storage unit with his personal effects and tools and some other things. And a land parcel. I found out about that in the last month. I'll tell you about that separately. And a cash account, not large, but enough to matter if you're the kind of person who has made it matter. She looked at George and then at James. Nicole filed a claim on his estate 6 months ago. She's claiming that because my mother is incapacitated, and I was the only direct relative under legal age, which I was, when she filed, she has the standing to administer everything. Except that I turned 18 while the proceedings were pending. And now she's losing the legal basis, which is why she went back to the custody argument, which is why Ramirez is across the street in a gray Accord at 7 in the morning. The logic of it, the specific, cold, efficient logic of using a young woman as a procedural instrument. Not because Nicole Torres was uncomplicated as a person there were, as there almost always are, more layers to it than the simple version, but because the procedure served the interest. And the interest was clear. George said quietly. He talked about an estate plan. Darnell. He mentioned it once, 2 or 3 years before he disappeared. Said he was working on something. I didn't know what he meant. He was careful, Vanessa said. He was always careful about things that mattered. He didn't talk about it, because he didn't want anyone knowing what he had or where it was. She set her brush down and leaned against the workbench. He talked to me about it when I was 16, told me there was a storage unit, told me where, told me that if anything ever happened to him I should find George White. He wrote the name down for me. George White at Garland's. She looked at George directly. He wrote it twice, like he wanted to make sure I'd remember. George's jaw did the thing it did. He called me, George said, 6 weeks before he disappeared. Said he might need a favor. I said name it. He said he'd call back when he had it figured out. A pause. He didn't call back. Because 53 days later, Vanessa said. Because 53 days later, George confirmed. Would you treat them with kindness? They stood in the specific silence of people who have just assembled a picture they've been carrying pieces of separately for 4 years, and have put them together on a surface where both can see it. And the picture is not a surprise, and it is also not easy to look at, because the picture is what it is. A man who knew his situation was complicated and took careful steps to protect the people who mattered to him and ran out of time to finish taking them. James said, the storage unit. Where is it? I know the address, Vanessa said. George, James said. I know where it is, George said. I've been paying the monthly fee since he disappeared. The room absorbed this. The specific fact of it, that for 4 years, every month, without announcement or credit, George White had been maintaining a dead man's storage unit because it belonged to him, and that was reason enough. Vanessa looked at George for a moment. Vanessa looked at George and something moved through her face that was not the composure, not the inventory-taking quality, not the refusal of fear, something older and quieter. Something that had not had occasion to appear yet, because she'd been in this building for less than 24 hours, and there are things that take longer than 24 hours to show. He has things in there, she said. I know some of it. He told me there was a bike. The Dyna, George said. 94. He built it from parts over 4 years. We run it once a month to keep it alive. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. He showed me pictures when I was 13. Sent them in pieces over 3 years, while he was building it, every time he finished something new. She looked at her hands. He called it the proof. The proof of what? Timothy Clark asked from somewhere across the room. He hadn't meant to ask it out loud, probably. It came out anyway. That patience pays, Vanessa said. That's what he used to say. You want to know if something's worth doing? See if you're still doing it 3 years later. Still finding satisfaction in the small increments. The proof is in the staying. Nobody had an answer for that, so nobody gave one. And the silence that followed was the specific kind that forms around words that have found their exact right weight. The plan formed quickly. Kenneth Lee pulled his truck around to the alley behind the garage. George got into the passenger seat. Vanessa got into the back. Would you treat them with kindness? And Timothy Clark, because Timothy had the specific and long-developed ability to make himself interesting to people who were watching. Things pulled his motorcycle out through the front of the garage, nice and slow, giving Jason Ramirez something to look at. Would you treat them with kindness? Something to track with his professional attention, a decision to make about whether the truck going the other way was worth noting. Timothy gave him 4 minutes of motorcycle. 4 minutes was enough. The storage facility was 23 minutes outside of town, off a state route that ran alongside an irrigation canal and had the particular quality of roads that exist for industry rather than convenience, functional, unlovely, honest about their purpose. The gate code still worked. George had been using it monthly for 4 years, and the facility had changed management once in that time. Would you treat them with kindness? But the code for Unit 47 had remained unchanged through the transfer because nobody at the new management company had had reason to change it, and nobody in Unit 47 had given them a reason to go looking. The unit smelled like oil and time. Kenneth stayed by the truck. George unlocked the roll door and lifted it, and the light that came in, green, was gray and sufficient and revealed what it revealed. The diner first, covered in a tarp that George lifted carefully from the front end back, revealing the tank and the forks and the engine and the frame that a man had spent 4 years assembling from individual components in whatever space he had available at the time, on whatever timeline his other obligations permitted, with a patience and attention to detail that was visible in every joint and surface. Vanessa made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound. Brief and involuntary. The kind of sound that escapes before the person making it has made a decision about whether to make it. Would you treat them with kindness? She was looking at the motorcycle the way you look at something you've seen in 2 dimensions for years and are now seeing for the first time in 3, and the additional dimension is doing something to the experience that the photographs had not prepared her for. She crossed the small space between the door and the bike, reached out, touched the handlebars with 2 fingers, just 2, just briefly, just the tip of the contact, then withdrew her hand. He rode it the week before he disappeared, George said. I was there. Last time anyone saw it move. Would you treat them with kindness? Vanessa took her hand back and looked at it for a moment, like she was checking whether the contact had left something on her fingers or taken something away. Then she looked at the wall to the right of the bike, where the canvas cases were stacked, 12 of them, 15 more in the protective tubes that serious painters use for storage and transport. And then she looked at the box. It was in the corner, standard cardboard, the kind available at any moving supply store, closed with packing tape that had yellowed slightly at the edges with age. On top, in black marker, in handwriting that Vanessa had last seen, on the birthday cards and the occasional letter, and the text messages that had become the primary medium of communication between a brother and sister separated by 6 years. And variable geography, the handwriting was blocky, slightly left-leaning, the kind that belongs to people who learn to write quickly and never unlearns the speed SK for when you need it, not when. Vanessa stood in front of the box for a moment. Just stood there, both hands loose at her sides, looking at those 5 words. For when you need it. The grammar of someone who has already decided that the needing is inevitable. Not hoping it won't come. Just preparing for when it does. The specific grammar of a person who loves someone well enough to plan for their worst-case scenarios rather than simply hoping the worst cases don't arrive. Did anyone open it? She asked. No, George said. Why not? Because it has your name on it, which was, in its way, a complete and sufficient answer. Would you treat them with kindness? Vanessa picked the box up. It was heavier than she'd expected, denser than its size suggested. The way things are dense when they've been packed carefully, when the person doing the packing was thinking about weight distribution and protection rather than speed. She set it on the hood of Kenneth's truck, which George had reversed partially into the unit to give her a surface. She worked at the tape. It was old tape, brittle, and it came away more easily than new tape would have, which was its own kind of comment on time. She opened the flaps. On top, an envelope. Her name on the front. Darnell's handwriting. Below the envelope, a folder, the thick kind, the kind that holds multiple documents in organized sections. She lifted the folder out first. Set the envelope aside for a moment, not avoiding it, just deferring it, the instinct of someone who knows that what's in the folder is information and what's in the envelope is something else. Would you treat them with kindness? And information can be processed while the something else may require processing of a different kind. She opened the folder. Read the first page. Stopped. Read it again. Her face was very controlled. Too controlled, which is different from normally controlled. Would you treat them with kindness? Which was itself different from the composure she'd been maintaining since the garage. This was the stillness of someone who has just received a fact that has reorganized the architecture of everything they thought they understood about a specific past, and is standing in the rubble of the reorganization trying to find load-bearing walls. This is a guardianship document, she said. Her voice was steady. The kind of steady that is different from ordinary steadiness. The kind that is the result of active effort. George leaned in and looked at the top page. Then he turned it. Would you treat them with kindness? His expression changed in the way that expressions change when you're reading something that recontextualizes everything you already knew about a person, not surprises you exactly, because it's consistent with who that person was, but lands with weight because it confirms what you hoped was true and had been unable to verify. Darnell Cooper had filed for emergency legal guardianship of Vanessa Carter when she was 16 years old. The filing was dated. Would you treat them with kindness? The family court of their home county, a different county, 2 states west, where their mother had been, and where Vanessa had been, and where all of this had started, had approved the filing conditionally, pending Darnell's demonstration of stable housing and documented income over a 60-day period, at which point he was to submit the final paperwork, and the guardianship would be formalized. He had had 60 days to complete the process. He had disappeared on day 53. Vanessa was looking at the document. Not reading anymore, she'd read it. All of it. The formal language of courts and intentions and conditions. She was looking at it the way you look at something when you're not seeing the surface of it anymore, but the thing it points to. He was coming to get me, she said, quietly, flatly. The voice of a person doing arithmetic and arriving at an answer they cannot argue with even though they want to. He was setting it up, all of it, the housing, the income documentation, everything the court required. He was going to file the final paperwork and come get me. And I didn't know, George said. He probably didn't want to tell you until it was certain, until there was nothing left that could fall through. He didn't want me to hope too much, Vanessa said. And the word hope in her mouth at that moment had the quality of a word that has been turned over many times in private, that has worn smooth at the edges from handling not the bright prospective word that hope usually is, but the other version, the retrospective one, the hope that you understand too late, the hope that was operating all around you while you were surviving the absence of it and you didn't know it was there. She set the folder down on the hood of the truck and picked up the envelope. It was sealed the old way, with moisture, with the intention of permanence. She worked the flap up carefully. Inside, 2 pages folded in thirds, covered front and back in Darnell's handwriting. Not typed, not printed. Written by hand, which meant he'd sat somewhere and thought through what to say and then said it in the medium that requires commitment, the one you can't revise without starting over. She read it in the silence of the storage unit, while George stood near the truck and looked at the canal through the open door and gave her what he could give her, which was the intention of privacy even in the absence of its possibility. She read it once. Then she read it again, starting from the second paragraph, the one that changed the character of the first. Would you treat them with kindness? Her eyes moved through it with the careful attention of someone who is not going to let themselves misread anything, is not going to let the urgency of the emotion distort the precision of the information. When she finished, she folded it along the original creases. Put it back in the envelope. Put the envelope in the inner pocket of the oversized jacket, the breast pocket, close to the body, the pocket for things that need to be kept. He knew, she said. Not to George specifically. To the space. To the storage unit and the covered motorcycle and the canvas cases stacked against the wall, and the box that had been sitting with her name on it for 4 years waiting for the day when she needed it. He knew his situation was complicated. He doesn't say who. He says there were people, he uses that word people, with a weight to it, who had an interest in his not being able to finish what he was doing. She paused. He says if something happens and I find this box, I should go to George White at Garland's. Would you treat them with kindness? She looked at George then, and there was something in her expression that was not the composure, not any of the managed versions of herself, but the direct thing underneath all of it. Would you treat them with kindness? The person who had been 16 years old when her brother disappeared, and who had been holding the knowledge of his absence like a weight that had no place to be put down. He wrote your full name. George White. He said you'd know what to do. George was quiet for a moment. His hands were in his jacket pockets, and he was looking at the motorcycle under the tarp. He called me 6 weeks before he disappeared, George said. Asked if I could keep something for him. I said of course. He said he'd tell me more when he had it figured out. A pause. 2 days later he dropped off a key to this unit, left it with Ryan. Didn't come in himself. I thought... He stopped. I thought he'd come by and explain. And then 53 days later, Vanessa said. And then 53 days later, George confirmed. Would you treat them with kindness? They were both quiet then, and the quiet had the texture of 4 years of not knowing enough to grieve properly, of holding a loss that had no proper ceremony, because the shape of it was wrong, because losses that don't have complete information don't close the way completed. Losses close, they stay open, they stay provisional, and the provisional nature of them costs something every day in a way that resolved grief, however heavy, does not. Vanessa took the folder back out and opened it. She was looking at it differently now, not at what it said, but at what it implied, at the secondary information that lived in the structure of the document rather than its content. She doesn't know this exists, she said. Nicole, if she knew this was here, she would have used it. She would have had her lawyers argue that it was invalid because the final filing was never submitted. But she hasn't, which means she doesn't know. She looked up at George, which means we have something she doesn't know we have. George looked at her with an expression that was, for a moment, purely evaluative, not approving or disapproving but assessing, the way you assess something that is demonstrating a quality you hadn't fully calibrated for. Darnell used to think that way, he said, about information, about what people know and don't know and where the room to move is. He taught me, Vanessa said, simply, without elaboration because it didn't need elaboration. Kenneth Lee said from near the truck, without looking up from his phone, James wants to know how long you need. Vanessa looked at the box, at the canvas cases along the wall, at the motorcycle under its tarp, at the document them with kindness. Documents in her hand which were not just a dead man's incomplete paperwork but a record of what he'd been trying to do, proof of his intent preserved in the formal language of courts. Something that had survived him and was now available to do work on behalf of the person he'd been trying to protect. Tell him we need a lawyer today, she said. Not tomorrow. Kenneth looked up. It's a Wednesday. Would you treat them with kindness? I know what day it is, Vanessa said, and her voice carried something in it that had not been there when she'd walked through the side door of Garland's garage the previous morning. Not the composure, not the measuring quality, not the precise public version of herself that she'd been presenting since arrival. Something rawer and more combustible, the particular quality of someone who has spent 14 months running and has just found solid ground and is not, under any circumstances, moving from it again. Tell him I need a lawyer today. Kenneth was already texting. The drive back was quiet in a different way from the drive out. On the way out, the quiet had been anticipatory, something ahead of them waiting to be found. On the way back, the quiet had the quality of things already found, of information already in hand and not yet fully processed, of would you treat them with kindness, of multiple people doing the work of incorporating new facts into existing understandings, and discovering that the incorporation requires significant structural adjustment. Would you treat them with kindness? Vanessa sat in the back of Kenneth's truck with the folder on her lap and Darnell's letter in her breast pocket and looked out the window at the October light on the Tennessee landscape, which was doing what October light does in this state, which is to turn everything golden and valedictory, like the world is wrapping something up. She was not seeing the landscape. She was seeing the arithmetic. The guardianship document was real. It was filed. It was in the county system. The court that had approved it conditionally still existed. The judge who had signed it, she had read the name, a specific name. A person was presumably findable. The filing was not hypothetical or informal or verbal. It was a legal document, executed with legal intention, that had been interrupted by circumstances outside the filer's control. That was different from a filing that had been abandoned. That was a different category of thing. Nicole Torres had filed her estate claim 6 months ago, before Vanessa turned 18, on the basis that Vanessa was a minor with no legal guardian. The guardianship document predated the estate claim. If the guardianship document established intent, even an incomplete, conditionally approved, not yet finalized intent, it predated and potentially complicated Nicole's that Nicole did not know to account for, because Nicole did not know the document existed. The space between what Nicole knew and what Nicole didn't know. That space was where there was room to move. Vanessa looked at the folder in her lap, looked at the letter-sized envelope that was the second thing in the folder. Below the guardianship documents, she'd noticed it on the first pass and set it aside, because the letter in her pocket had taken all available attention, but she took it out now and read what was on the outside. It wasn't addressed to her. It was addressed, in Darnell's handwriting, to George White, with a note below the name open with Vanessa. She looked at George in the passenger seat. "There's something else in here." George turned, looked at the envelope. Something moved through his expression recognition, or something near it. The quality of a person encountering a thing they expected at some level without consciously knowing they expected it. "He sent me a letter," George said, 3 years before he disappeared. Said if anything ever happened, there was paperwork in storage that would explain. I kept the letter. Didn't know what the paperwork was. A beat. I still have it. At home, Vanessa held out the envelope. George took it. He opened it with the deliberate care of someone who has been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for 4 years. Inside, a single page. Not a letter exactly, more like a list, organized under 2 headings. The first heading said property. The second said Vanessa. Under property, the storage unit with its contents. The cash account with its current balance at the time of writing, which was not enormous but was not nothing. And an address. A Tennessee address. Not in this county. Another county, the next one over. An address with the notation, land parcel. Deed enclosed separately. Deed is in Vanessa's name. Under Vanessa, 3 sentences. George read them. Read them again. His jaw did the thing. "The land parcel," he said. "The deed is in your name." Vanessa looked at him. "Would you treat them with kindness?" She hadn't read the list yet. She'd handed it over without reading it, which was the specific trust of someone who has already decided, inside the previous 45 minutes, that this man is one of the people she can hand things to. "He bought a piece of land and put it in my name," George said. "When you were 16. It's not part of his estate. It was never part of his estate. It's yours." The truck hit a patch of rough road and the chassis absorbed it, and the October light kept doing what it was doing, and Vanessa Carter sat in the back seat with the folder on her lap and the letter in her breast pocket, and the specific stillness of someone who has just been told that the person they loved most was thinking about them, specifically them with kindness, specifically and practically, and with the careful foresight of someone who took seriously the possibility of their own absence and made arrangements for it, made them without announcement or credit, made them and left them in a box with a girl's name on it for the day when she would need them. "He bought me a place to go," she said, barely audible over the sound of the road. "Before he knew he wouldn't be there to take you," George said just as quietly. "Would you treat them with kindness?" The truck moved through the October landscape and neither of them said anything else for several miles, because there was nothing that needed saying, and also because the thing that had just been said required space to exist in, required air around it, required the specific silence, not the comfortable silence of 2 people who have run out of conversation, but the profound and particular silence of 2 people who are, for a moment, in the presence of something that is bigger than what words are good at. Mark Anderson's office was in a 3-story building downtown, the kind that had been built in the 1950s when downtown meant something different and had been repurposed several times since, without quite landing on a final identity. The 3rd floor smelled like old radiator heat and the specific dusty quality of paper archives maintained over decades, and Mark Anderson himself looked like a man who had been born in a slightly too large suit, and had made peace with this as a permanent condition. 57, thin, reading glasses on his forehead, legal mind that James had once described to George as the trap kind slow to set, impossible to leave once it closes. He read Darnell's documents in 11 minutes without speaking, which was, Vanessa noted, exactly the right amount of time, not a skim, not a show, but a thorough first reading conducted at the pace of a person who reads with their full attention and trusts that attention. When he finished, he removed his glasses from his forehead and set them on the desk. "Where did these come from?" he asked. "Storage unit," George said. "His. We've been maintaining it." "Since when?" "Since he disappeared." Anderson looked at the documents again, looked at Vanessa. "You had no knowledge of any of this? The guardianship filing, the land parcel, none of it?" "No. And Nicole Torres filed the estate claim 6 months ago. According to the paperwork I've seen, yes." Anderson leaned back, looked at the ceiling for 4 seconds, which Vanessa was already identifying as his processing position, eyes out of the way, full available processing power applied to the problem. Then he brought his eyes back down. "The conditional approval is real and it's dated," he said. "This court still exists. The filing is in the system. I can pull it up right now and I guarantee it's there, 'cause these things don't disappear. What Nicole Torres is doing is filing under the assumption that Darnell's estate has no designated administrator, and that you, as an 18-year-old with no fixed address and no formal guardian, are in legal limbo." He tapped the guardianship document. "She's not wrong about the limbo. She's wrong about its character. Darnell was not absent from your life. He was in the process of becoming legally responsible for it. The fact that he disappeared before the process completed is not abandonment." He paused. "It's interruption. Involuntary interruption of a legal process in active progress. The intent was established. The process was valid. The outcome should be honored in the spirit of what was initiated." "And the land parcel," George said. "Not part of the estate," Anderson said immediately. "Never was. A deed in Vanessa's name, executed when she was 16, is her property. Has been her property since the day Darnell signed it. Nicole Torres has no claim on it. When I submit this in the estate proceeding, her basis collapses." He looked at Vanessa steadily. "You understand what I'm telling you?" "She filed on an assumption," Vanessa said, "and the assumption is wrong in 2 separate ways." "Correct. And she doesn't know about either document. Not if she hasn't filed anything that addresses them, which she hasn't." Vanessa looked at the folder in her lap, at the documents that her brother had assembled and sealed and left in a box with her name on it for a day he'd been preparing for, without telling her he was preparing for it. Which was, she understood now, its own kind of love, the kind that works in the background, that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't ask to be thanked or acknowledged, that simply builds the structure and leaves the door unlocked. "What do we need to do?" she said. Anderson was already reaching for his phone. "I'm calling the courthouse. We're requesting a continuance on any emergency motion Nicole Torres files. She'll object. The judge may or may not grant it." He looked at Vanessa over his glasses. "If it's denied, we walk in with what we have and we make it enough." "It's enough," Vanessa said. Anderson looked at her for a moment with the evaluative quality that lawyers develop over years of measuring the distance between what clients say and what they can actually sustain. Then he nodded. Once, the nod of a man revising an estimate upward, and dialed. 40 minutes later, George got a text from James. He read it. His expression did not change exactly, but something around the edges of it shifted in the way that things shift when you receive confirmation of something you were hoping wasn't coming. The continuance had been denied. The judge had reviewed Nicole Torres's emergency motion, which cited potential ongoing harm to a vulnerable young woman in an unstable environment, and had decided that was not something to postpone. The hearing was scheduled, day after tomorrow, 9 in the morning. George held his phone and looked at it for a moment, looked at Vanessa, who was across the room gathering the documents back into the folder with the same systematic care with which she organized her brushes. She looked up and saw his expression and understood it without him saying anything. "How long?" she asked. "Day after tomorrow. 9 a.m. The room was quiet. Then Vanessa said, "Okay." Then we use the day we have. And the word "okay" in her mouth, in that moment, was not a word of resignation. It was a word of reorganization, of someone who has received a timeline and is already calculating what can be done within it, what must be done, what order the doing must happen in. The word of a person who has been surviving on short timelines for 14 months and has become, in the course of that survival, efficient in a way that only necessity produces. She picked up the folder, picked up her coffee, which had gone cold on Anderson's desk during the 11 minutes meeting and the subsequent conversations, drank it anyway without any visible opinion about the temperature. "We need James to have as many people as can come to that courthouse," she said, "not to cause anything, just to be there, present, a fact." She looked at George. "And I need to go back to the garage. You don't want to take a few hours?" "I need to paint," she said. And the way she said it was not the bravado of someone declaring their resilience for an audience. It was the simple statement of a person who knows what their stabilizing mechanism is and is not confused about when they need to use it. "That's where I can think. That's where I can process this. That's where I need to be right now." George put on his jacket. The drive back to the garage was quiet the way it always was. When George was driving, not uncomfortable, just the silence of a man who was not in the habit of filling air with sound that didn't serve a purpose. The late afternoon light was doing its October thing, long and golden, and pointed in the way that late afternoon light in the fall is always pointed, as if it's aware of its own transience, as if it knows it won't be here long, and is trying to illuminate as much as possible while it can. Vanessa sat in the passenger seat with the folder on her lap and Darnell's letter in her breast pocket, and looked out the window at the town, going by the buildings and the lots, and the specific American geography of a mid-sized Tennessee city, in the process of being several things at once. She was thinking about the hearing, about the documents, about Nicole Torres, who was not a simple person, who had her own losses and her own history with this family, and her own specific version of the past that she had organized into the shape that served her purposes, and who had made a calculation about what was available and what she could reach and had reached for it. Would you treat them with kindness? She was also thinking about Darnell, who had been thinking about her, who had been making plans for her safety in the specific, practical way of someone who understands that love without infrastructure is sentiment, who understands that the people you love need more than your love. They need the structures you build around it, the mechanisms you put in place, the box you seal with their name on it, and leave somewhere someone reliable will maintain. "He knew me," Vanessa said, to the window, to the passing landscape, to no one in particular, and the one particular person who was present. "He knew exactly how I'd get here, exactly what I'd need. He knew the whole shape of it, the whole trajectory. He planned for it." Her voice was even. "Almost. I just wish he'd told me." "He didn't tell you because he was trying to protect you from hoping for something that might not work out," George said. "He didn't want you counting on something he couldn't guarantee." "I know," Vanessa said. "I know that's why. It's still I know." She didn't finish. Didn't need to. George drove. The October light kept pointing. The truck moved through it. And in the folder on her lap, and the pocket close to her chest, and the storage unit 23 minutes behind her, Darnell Cooper's careful love sat in its various forms, waiting to do the work he'd intended it to do from the beginning, waiting for the day his sister needed it, which had turned out to be this one. Amy Walker left a plate outside the door at 10 o'clock. She didn't knock, didn't announce herself. Would you treat them with kindness? Didn't slide a note under the door explaining the contents or the intent or anything else that might have transformed a simple act of feeding into the kind of gesture that requires acknowledgement. She just set the plate on the hallway floor outside the guest room of her house on Elm Street, 4 blocks from the garage, and went back downstairs. And the sound of her footsteps receding down the hardwood stairs was the only signal that anything had happened at all. Vanessa heard her go. She'd been awake. Would you treat them with kindness? She'd been awake since George dropped her off, and she'd eaten the dinner Amy had made earlier at the kitchen table. Both of them, with the folder of documents between them like a third person at the meal, and Amy asking about the painting rather than the hearing. Would you treat them with kindness? Asking about the Cooper family emblem and what it looked like and why the wings were architectural rather than decorative. And Vanessa talking about it in the way she talked about painting. Would you treat them with kindness? Which was the only way she talked about anything without some portion of herself standing guard at the perimeter. After dinner, she'd come upstairs. Read the letter again. Would you treat them with kindness? Then, which was different from the first time in the specific way that second readings are always different, because the first time you're receiving the information, and the second time you're living inside it. The letter was 2 pages. Darnell's handwriting, front and back of both pages, the pen pressing hard the way it did when he was writing quickly, which he was doing because he was, she understood now, writing it under the specific pressures of someone who knows their time on a thing is limited and wants to say everything necessary before the limit arrives. He wrote about the guardianship filing. He wrote about why he hadn't told her not, because he didn't think she could handle it. He wrote, and she believed him, because that was not the kind of thing Darnell said to soften information he was withholding for other reasons. He wrote it because it was true, but because he wanted to hand her a completed thing, a done thing, not a work in progress that might still fall through. He wrote about the land parcels. He wrote about the land parcel. He wrote the address and the county assessor's office where the deed was registered and the name of the attorney who had handled the transaction. He wrote about the storage unit and the bike and the canvases, and why he had painted on canvas instead of the surfaces people expected him to paint on. Because canvas is private, he wrote, it's what you make for yourself, not for an audience. And I needed something that was mine. And then, near the end, the part that had stopped her on the first reading, and stopped her again on the second. I know you're angry at me right now for the shape of how I left things. You're allowed to be. But I need you to know that everything I did, every decision I made in the last 3 years, I made it thinking about you. What you'd need. What would hold. What would still be standing when everything else wasn't. You were the reason I tried to be better at being a person. You were the reason I tried at all. The road takes things. I know that better than most, but I was always trying to make sure it couldn't take you. She sat on the edge of the guest bed, with the letter in her lap, and both palms pressed flat over her eyes, and she didn't cry. Not because she wasn't with kindness, not because she wasn't capable of it, and not because she'd made a decision not to, but because the thing moving through her at that moment was older and more architectural than tears, was the specific them with kindness, was the specific processing that grief does when it has been waiting a long time for the correct information, and finally receives it, and has to reorganize everything it thought it knew. 4 years of absence. 14 months of running, and underneath all of it, the whole time, her brother had been present in the most permanent way available to him in the structures he'd built, in the documents he'd filed, in the careful, unannounced infrastructure of someone who loves you enough to plan for the possibility of their own absence. 4 minutes. She sat there for 4 minutes. She counted not deliberately, just because her mind was counting things the way minds do when they're processing and need something sequential to hold on to. Would you treat them with kindness? Then she folded the letter along its original creases, turned to the envelope and placed it in the innermost breast pocket of Darnell's jacket, which she was still wearing, which she wore every day, which she had been wearing since the week he disappeared, when she'd found it in a box of his things that their mother had been clearing out and had taken it had been clearing asking, because it was his, and it was all she had, and it was the right size for carrying an absence in. She called Mark Anderson. He answered on the second ring, which told her he'd been expecting the call, which told her he was the kind of lawyer who thought about his clients after business hours, which was the kind of lawyer she needed tonight. They talked for 22 minutes. Would you treat them with kindness? She told him about the paragraph near the end of the letter, the one about the 3 years of decisions, about what would hold, about what would still be standing. She told him why it mattered legally, not emotionally, but legally, because it was evidence of sustained, deliberate, ongoing intent, not a spontaneous decision, not a reaction to a specific crisis, but a 3-year pattern of choices made in service of a specific goal. Anderson was quiet for a moment after she said this. Then he said she was right, and he needed to think about how to use it, and she should sleep if she could. She did not sleep if she could. Would you treat them with kindness? She lay in the dark of Amy Walker's guest room, which smelled like lavender from the candle on the dresser, and old wood from the house itself, which was the kind of house that had been a home for long enough that the home had become structural, had gotten into the materials. And she stared at the ceiling, and she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about the hearing, and she thought about Nicole Torres, and she thought about the documents in the folder, and she thought about what Anderson had said about the character of the limbo and the difference between interruption and abandonment. And then she thought about the wall. She'd been thinking about the wall since the first morning, since she'd stood in the garage and measured it with her eyes and understood that it was wrong, not damaged, not ugly, just empty in the specific way that empty is wrong when a surface has earned the right to mean something. She'd been building the mural in her head every night since then. The road first. The sky above it, actual sky, atmospheric, done in gradations that took patience and understanding of how light works at different elevations and times of day. Then the bikes. Then the riders. Would you treat them with kindness? Then the figures at the center. She knew exactly what the center needed. Had known since the storage unit, since she'd seen the motorcycle under the tarp, since she'd understood that some things survive the people who made them and go on doing the work those people intended. She was at the garage at 5:53 in the morning. The sky outside was the specific dark of pre-dawn in October, the dark that has already made a commitment to becoming light but hasn't gotten there yet, a promise rather than a fact. She let herself in through the side door, which James had given her a key to the previous evening with no ceremony whatsoever, just a key on a plain ring set on the second bench from the window with no accompanying explanation, because explanations were not what that gesture required. She made coffee, set up her case. Would you treat them with kindness? Stood in front of the back wall for 11 minutes and looked at it with the specific focused attention of someone finalizing a decision they've already made. Would you treat them with kindness? Confirming the measurements of a space they've been measuring for days in their head and are now measuring with their eyes in real light and finding the correspondence exact. Then she started. The road came first. Would you treat them with kindness? She worked full width of the wall, laying down the foundation of the image the way you lay down a foundation, not because it's the visible part, but because everything visible depends on it. Because if the foundation is wrong, the whole structure is wrong, and no amount of technique applied later will correct it. The road curved slightly in the lower third of the wall, the specific curve of a Tennessee Tulane in the morning. Would you treat them with kindness? The kind that has been there long enough that the road has settled into the land, and the land has settled around the road, and they've arrived at a mutual understanding. She got the curve right on the first pass, which was not luck. Would you treat them with kindness? Was the consequence of looking at roads and thinking about roads and painting roads for long enough that the information lived in her hand, rather than her head, and her hand knew what to do without waiting for instructions. James found her there at 6:58. Would you treat them with kindness? He'd come in early, which was not a coincidence. Early mornings were how James Smith processed things that were too large for the ordinary hours of the day, the things that didn't fit in the regular-sized container of the usual schedule and needed more room than that. He came through the side door, and he saw the light on, and he saw the back wall, and he stopped. Because even in the first hour of the work, with only the road and the preliminary sky, and the first ghost of ghost color indicating where the horizon was going to live, it was clear that the back wall of Garland's garage was not going to be the same wall it had been yesterday morning. Something was already with kindness. Something was already happening there, something with the quality of intention and specificity, and a kind of certainty that is rare enough in any form that when you encounter it you stop, regardless of what you were doing, before you encountered it, and give it your attention. He got coffee from the machine in the break room, pulled up a stool 15 feet from the wall, where he had a sight line to the whole surface, and he sat there with his coffee, and he watched Vanessa Carter paint. She didn't acknowledge him. Not because she didn't with kindness, not because she didn't know he was there. She knew exactly where everyone was in any room she occupied, had been doing that since before she could have named the skill. But because acknowledging him would have meant stepping out of the state she was in, and the state she was in was the one where the work happens, the productive trance that serious painters enter when the decision-making part of the process is finished and the executing part has begun, and the two things are so integrated that to interrupt one is to interrupt both. By the time the rest of the garage arrived at 7:30, would you treat them with kindness? The wall had progressed to the point where the road was fully established and the sky above it was beginning its color work, and several of the ghost outlines of the rider figures were starting to resolve from intention into presence. Ryan Robinson came in, saw the wall, stopped walking. Daniel Lopez came in and did the same thing. By 8:15, there were 4 men in the garage who were not doing what they'd come in to do. Would you treat them with kindness? Who were instead standing or sitting at various distances from the back wall watching a woman paint, the way you watch something that doesn't come along frequently enough to take for granted. She worked through the morning without stopping. Ate half a granola bar from her jacket pocket around 9:45, washing it down with cold coffee from the mug she'd filled at 5:53, without interrupting what her hands were doing. The kind of eating that is purely functional, calories as fuel rather than meal as experience. The sky on the wall was doing by 10 in the morning what October skies in Tennessee do at about 4 in the afternoon, the deep gradation from pale at the horizon through saturated blue to something approaching violet at the top edge, the atmospheric perspective that makes distance feel real rather than depicted. Strand, who was not a man given to unsolicited commentary on anything, stood in front of the upper portion for approximately 5 minutes and then said, to no one in particular, "How do you make it look like there's actual air in there?" "Temperature," Vanessa said, without turning around. "Warm colors come forward. Cool colors recede. You're not painting color. You're painting depth," which explained it completely and not at all. And Ryan Robinson gave Strand a look that said as much. And Strand gave him a look back that said he knew, and neither of them moved from where they were standing. She worked through lunch. Would you treat them with kindness? James brought her a sandwich from the place 2 blocks over without asking what she wanted, and she ate it at the bench with her left hand, while her right was still making decisions about the lower third of the wall. And it was turkey, which she'd mentioned to no one, and she ate the whole thing, without registering any particular opinion about it, because she was thinking about the wall and the food was incidental. By 3 in the afternoon the figures were emerging. Not one at a time. All of them simultaneously, which was her method, building across the full surface in layers. Nothing complete until everything was complete. The way reality works. The way the world assembles itself not in sequence, but in accumulation. The riders were coming into definition from the ground up. From the ground, from the road that carried them, and the quality of the figures was the quality she'd been working towards since she'd first conceived the piece. Not portraits, not literal representations, but something more essential, the distillation of presence, rather than its documentation. If you knew these men, you would find yourself in that wall. Not your face, your weight. The particular way you occupy space when you're in your element. When you're doing the thing you do best, when you are most fully and irreducibly yourself. George White came and stood in front of the wall at 3:45 and looked at it for a long time without speaking. He found himself in it not immediately, because the figures were not in a state of completion, but his eye kept returning to one form in the middle ground, one figure whose particular quality of attention, even rendered at this stage of development, had something in it that he recognized without being able to immediately say from where. Then he placed it, and he stood there with the recognition in him, and the coffee that had gone cold in his hand, and he said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and saying something would have required diminishing the moment into the size of words. Amy Walker came by the garage at 5 with a covered container of food, which she handed to George rather than to Vanessa, because she understood instinctively the architecture of the situation. Would you treat them with kindness? Underdusud was in the middle of something that should not be interrupted, and she stood for a moment inside the side door looking at the wall, and then she looked at George and she said, very quietly, She does this like she's reminding the wall of what it already knows. George looked at her. That's exactly what she's doing, he said. Amy left. The food went on the center table. The garage continued. Would you treat them with kindness? And the wall continued to become what it was becoming, the light shifting through the afternoon from the particular quality of productive afternoon into the particular quality of late afternoon, which has a different urgency to it, a different color temperature, a sense of time moving in a way that morning hours don't have. And Vanessa kept working. She did not go back to Amy's house that evening. Treat them nice? She stayed in there until 9:14, which was when the detail work on the figures had progressed far enough that she could leave it overnight without losing the thread, could sleep and return and continue from where she'd stopped, without having to re-enter the work from the beginning. Would you treat them with kindness? She covered her brushes, wrote a note to herself on a scrap of paper about the color temperature issue she'd identified in the upper right quadrant and what she intended to do about it in the morning. Ate the food Amy had left, drank a glass of water, sat on the stool 15 feet from the wall and looked at what was there, which was already more than she'd had access to in the storage unit, more than the folder, more than the letter, because this was not a document of what Darnell had been trying to do. This was the doing itself, the actual completion of the thing he'd started, the carrying forward. She slept for 4 hours in the back room on the cot that was there for the purposes of people who needed a few hours and didn't have time to go further, and she was up at 2:40 kindness? And she was up at 2:45, and by 3:15 she was working again because the pre-dawn hours were for the things that needed uninterrupted attention, and the sky at the top of the wall needed another pass before the riders could be completed, and the riders needed to be right. By 7 in the morning on the 4th day, the figures were done, all of them, each one with the specific weight of a particular person, without the specific features of that person. The paradox of a portrait that works by not being a portrait, by going below the face to the thing the face sits on top of, the character beneath the appearance. And at the center of it, larger than the others, riding with the particular quality that James had recognized the previous morning when he'd come in early and stood in front of the wall for a long time without saying anything, because he knew that posture, that specific arrangement of shoulders and hands, and the quality of attention in the way the figure held the bars, had ridden behind it for 9 years and would have known it in any medium, in any scale. Darnell Cooper was in the center of the back wall of Garland's garage. Would you treat them with kindness? Riding the road that curved through the lower third of the painting, moving through the Tennessee light that Vanessa had built from the ground up across 4 days of sustained work. And just behind him, one position, the specific distance of someone riding with, rather than riding after a smaller figure, with the same quality of attention, the same quality of presence, riding at an angle that suggested not following but the specific dynamic of catching up, of drawing level, of arriving at the position they were always going to arrive at. James Smith had come in at 6:47. Would you treat them with kindness? He stood in front of the wall for 4 minutes and 11 seconds, which was longer than he'd stood in front of anything in recent memory that wasn't an engine he was diagnosing. And he did not speak. Would you treat them with kindness? And the things moving through his face were the things that move through the faces of men who have made a practice of not letting their faces say much when something has gotten past the practice. Vanessa found him there when she arrived from the back room at 7. She stopped when she saw him. Let him have the remaining time he needed with it, which was another 40 seconds, because she was a person who understood that looking at something important required its own space and its own pace, and could not be hurried without losing something essential. You've got one thing left to do, James said. I know, Vanessa said. I've been saving it. She walked to the wall. She took the smallest brush in her case 3 hairs, effectively. A brush so fine it was barely a brush at all. The kind of instrument used for the work that requires the most control, because the margin for error is the smallest. She went to the lower right corner of the wall, where she had left a space the size of a playing card, roughly, empty since the first day, maintained as empty through 4 days of work around it, protected. She mixed a color not from memory. She mixed testing it, but testing it against the specific colors already present in that section of the wall until she had the right value and temperature, the thing that would belong without dominating. She touched the brush to the wall. The garage had been filling while she worked. People had arrived, seen the stage of the wall. Would you treat them with kindness? Made the wordless collective decision to stay where they were rather than begin their usual activities? Would you treat them with kindness? And the room had accumulated the specific quality of attention that forms when a significant number of people are all oriented toward the same thing, and all understand that what is happening is the kind of thing that will not happen again. Nobody was making noise. The radio was off, had been off since early morning. The October light was coming in through the corrugated siding at the angle it came in at 7 on a fall morning, which was the specific angle that illuminated the wall fully. Vanessa painted a wrench and a paintbrush, crossed, in the lower right corner of the back wall of Garland's garage, 4 days after she'd walked through the side door without knocking. The same image as the tattoo on the inside of her left wrist. Would you treat them with kindness? The same image she'd been carrying on her body since she was 17 years old and had put it there because she needed something permanent in the days when nothing else felt permanent, when everything was either already gone or in the process of going. Below the crossed tools, in script that matched the script elsewhere in the mural, she painted 4 words. DC taught me to see. Darnell's mark, his signature in her hand, on the wall of the place that had been his, in the building where his people had kept his motorcycle alive for 4 years, because it was his, and that was reason enough. She stepped back, set the brush down, did not look at the painting, looked at the floor for a moment, at her feet, at the concrete that had been here since before any of them, and breathed. Ryan Robinson was the first one to speak. His voice had the specific roughness of a voice that has been doing a particular kind of work and has not been entirely successful at it. That's him, Ryan said. To no one and everyone. That's exactly him. Not a description, not an opinion, a recognition. The simple act of seeing something true and naming it, which is the oldest and most necessary function of language, and the one that fails most often and that had not failed here. The room was quiet for another moment. The kind of quiet that wants to stay, that no one is in a hurry to end. George White came and stood beside Vanessa. He put one arm around her shoulders, briefly, with the care of someone who understands that certain forms of contact need to be offered rather than assumed, and he held it for a moment, and she let him, which was its own measure of how far the last 5 days had traveled, that she could stand inside someone's arm and not immediately reconstruct the distance between herself and everything around her. Then, James said, "All right." He said it the way he said things when he was calling a room back from somewhere it had gone, not curtly, not dismissively. Would you treat them with kindness, but with the specific authority of a man who understands that the important things need to be named and also that the work needs to continue, that both things are true and neither cancels the other. Somebody actually has to work today. Laughter, real laughter, the kind that releases something. And then Vanessa. She looked at him. He was holding something in his right hand. He crossed the floor and stood in front of her and held out his palm. In it was a piece of leather not large, approximately the dimensions of a playing card, rectangular, cut cleanly. On its surface, painted by hand rather than professionally applied, an image, a paintbrush, and a wrench crossing each other, with a single hawk feather laid beneath the intersection, the feather falling at the angle that falling things fall, when there's no wind to complicate the fall, straight and certain. Daniel designed it, James said. Someone he knows made it last night. He held it out toward her, and something in his expression had moved past the managed pride and had moved past the managed quality it usually maintained into something more direct, more unguarded, not sentimental. James Smith was not a man who trafficked in sentiment. Would you treat them with kindness? But honest the specific way that honesty looks when it's coming from a person who has been around long enough to know its value and choose it deliberately. It's not a membership patch. That's a different road and a longer conversation. This is, he stopped, found the word. This is a belonging patch. It means you're here. This is your place. And anyone who needs to know that can look at this and know it. Vanessa looked at the patch in his hand. She did not reach for it immediately. She looked at it for a moment, the leather, the design, the feather falling straight and certain, and something moved through her face that was not any of the managed things she'd been presenting since she walked in 5 days ago. Not the composure, not the measuring quality, not the refusal of fear, not even the grief or the anger or the controlled determination of the previous 2 days. Something underneath all of that. The actual floor of the thing. The part of a person that exists prior to all the constructed versions, that has been there since before the construction was necessary. That is simply the self in its most basic and undefended form. "I've never belonged anywhere," she said, very quietly, like the sentence was being said for the first time, which it was. She had never said it aloud to anyone, had thought it many times in many different configurations across 14 months of motion, but had never said it to a room of people who were paying attention, had never placed it in the air between herself and others, had never given it the status of a spoken thing. "I know," James said. "That changes today." She reached out and took the patch, held it in both hands, looked down at it. The garage was very still around her. 28 men who had spent their lives in noise, who had made careers and communities out of the controlled application of force and speed, and the specific form of freedom that comes from moving fast through open country, all of them standing quietly, all of them present for this moment. All are present in the specific. The people are present when something is happening that they will remember for a long time and want to be fully inside when it happens. Because this was the thing, the real thing. Would you treat them with kindness? Under all the legal maneuvering and the documents and the hearing and the painting and the portfolio and the 4 years of absence and the 14 months of motion and the gray Accord across the street and the box with her name on it and the letter in her breast pocket under all of it, this was what all of it had been about. A person looking for the place where they put down roots. A person who had been moving so long that stillness had become a kind of myth, a rumor, something other people had that she understood intellectually but had not been permitted to experience. A person who treat them with kindness. A person who had finally, specifically, on a Tuesday in October in Tennessee, found the room where she did not have to explain herself from the beginning, where her name already meant something, where the things she was capable of had already been seen and valued, where there was a bench with kindness, where there was a bench with her name on it in the specific sense of a space that has been reorganized to accommodate your presence. She belonged here. And the fact of belonging, the actual, concrete, specific fact of it, not the concept but the thing itself, cost her. In that moment, the last remaining portion of the armor she had walked into this building wearing 5 days ago. Not all at once, not dramatically, not in any way that could be called collapse, but the final layer, the outermost layer, the one that said, "I don't need anything from anyone, and I've been fine and I'll keep being fine and I'm not asking." That layer came off, quietly, in the moment she was standing in the garage, holding a patch that said, "You're here and here is real, and this is yours." And the person underneath that layer was exactly who you'd expect to find 18 years old, tired in the bones, holding a grief that had been in constant transit for 4 years and 14 months, without a proper place to land, and finally, in a room that smelled like engine oil and October light and the particular industrial warmth of people who have made a practice of showing up, in a place where her brother's motorcycle was still being kept alive, 23 minutes down the road, because nobody had decided to stop, finally somewhere. "Now get back to work," James said. "Timothy's tank needs a fender, and he's been asking about it every 4 hours." "That was 2 days ago," Timothy said from across the room. "Every 4 hours," James confirmed in a tone that suggested the debate was not open. Vanessa laughed. Actually laughed. Fully. Without any architecture around it, without any management of it, without the portion of herself that usually stood at the perimeter of her expressions to monitor and control what escaped. The laugh that had been waiting behind 14 months of provisional everything, behind the 6 moves and the $22 gas station transaction and the gray Accord and the strategic legal maneuvering and the 4 days of painting and the hearing that was tomorrow morning and all the rest of it, just her laugh. The one she'd had since she was 9 years old, painting rain gutters on a roof while her brother stood below and told her she was getting it on her shoes. The same laugh, unchanged by everything that had happened to it, still the same frequency and the same quality, and the same way of landing in a room that her brother had once described, in a letter she now kept in her breast pocket, as the sound of someone who doesn't know they're happy yet and is being surprised by it. She was not surprised by it. She was, for the first time in a long time, completely and specifically and accurately located in the moment she was in. Which is the thing happiness actually is, when you strip away everything people add to it, not elevation, not the absence of difficulty, not the resolution of all outstanding problems, but simply being exactly where you are, and knowing it and not needing it to be anywhere else. She went back to the second bench, opened her case, ran her finger along the handles one more time. The inventory, the ritual, the thing she did before beginning, because beginning is its own preparation, and preparation is its own form of commitment, and she picked up a brush. The hearing was tomorrow. She had not forgotten the hearing. She was not naive about the hearing or what it would require, or the fact that Nicole Torres was not finished, and Jason Ramirez was still drawing a salary from somewhere, and that the estate question would outlast the emergency petition by months and would require sustained attention and sustained resources and sustained presence. She knew all of this. She had been thinking about all of this for 2 days in the way she thought about things, not anxiously, not ruminatively, but the way she thought about a surface before painting it, looking at the full shape of it, identifying what needed to happen in what order, understanding the sequence before making the first mark. She had the documents. She had the letter. Would you treat them with kindness? She had Mark Anderson, who had spent the previous 22 minutes of a phone call confirming that they had what they needed and that the character of the limbo was demonstrably different from the character Nicole Torres had been representing it as having. She had the people in this room, who James had already confirmed, would be in the courthouse parking lot tomorrow morning at 8:45. No patches, clean clothes, present, just present. A fact. And she had the bench, the second bench from the window, the one that had been reorganized to accommodate her. The afternoon light found the wall the way it found things in October, with a specificity that morning light doesn't have, with the particular quality of light that is aware of its own duration. The Cooper family emblem on the diner tank from the first day was dry on the workbench near the supply cabinet. The mural on the back wall was complete. Would you treat them with kindness? And at the second bench from the window, in a jacket that had been too big for her the day she took it, and was still too big for her now, and would remain too big for her because it was not her jacket, had never been her jacket, was the jacket of a man who had been 6 years older and built along different lines, and whose presence in it was not a ghost but a fact, a tangible ongoing fact. Vanessa Carter set the brush to metal and began. Tomorrow was tomorrow. Tonight, the Road King's fender was waiting. Would you treat them with kindness? The tank, and the 3 other commissions that had materialized over the previous days in the form of men who had come to her bench quietly and named figures that James had told her to double, and she had doubled, and the sums involved were the first genuinely stable financial ground she'd had in 14 months, which was a different kind of belonging from the patch, but no less real. Tomorrow was the hearing room, and Karen Martinez, and Nicole Torres, and the documents and Anderson's 11 minutes, and everything that came after. But tonight was the bench, and the brush, and the metal, and the October light, and those were enough. More than enough. Exactly enough. Outside on the highway, something large went by. A truck or a bus, moving fast in the direction of somewhere else, and the passage of it sent a vibration through the ground and through the concrete floor of the garage, and through the legs of every workbench and tool chest and stool in the building, a brief tremor, the physical reminder that the world is in motion, that things are always moving through and past, that nothing holds completely still. And then it passed, and the floor settled, and the garage returned to its ordinary sounds, the wrench, the engine, the radio coming back up to its usual volume in the back bay, the specific industrial music of people who have made a practice of showing up and doing the work and doing it again the next day. The ordinary sounds of a place that has been here long enough that it has become the kind of place people return to. The sounds that Darnell Cooper had worked inside for 9 years, and that had been here every day in the 4 years since he'd been gone, and that were here now, tonight, with his sister, at the second bench from the window. She was not running anymore, not calculating distances or counting days or building the mental map of the next place, the next move, the next provisional arrangement. Would you treat them with kindness? Not holding the whole of herself at a remove from her surroundings in the way you hold things when you're not sure the surroundings are going to last. When you've learned by repetition that attachment is a liability if the thing you're attached to is subject to revision. She had been doing all of those things for so long that not doing them felt, at first, like something missing, the absence of a weight you've been carrying so long that you'd forgotten the carrying was optional. It was optional. She was here, at the second bench from the window, in the garage that had been her brother's and was now, in the specific and expanding way that places become ours, hers, with the letter in her breast pocket, and the patch in her front pocket, and the tools laid out in front of her, in their precise order, each one in its designated place, everything organized against the day's work. And the day's work was in front of her, waiting to receive them with kindness. To receive what she had to give it, which was the thing she had always had, the thing her brother had identified in her when she was 9 years old on a rooftop, with paint on her shoes, the ability to look at a surface and see what it needed to become, and then the patience and the skill and the absolute unhesitating certainty to make it that. She touched brush to metal, and the brush knew where to go, the way it always had, the way it had been knowing since she was 9 years old, being taught by someone who knew. The mark it made was decisive. The mark it made was decisive, and the one after that, each one adding something to the surface that had not been there before, each one moving the thing from what it was toward what it was going to be. Outside, October kept doing what October does in Tennessee. The light moved, the road waited, and inside the garage, at the second bench from the window, Darnell Cooper's little sister painted. She was home, for the first time in a long time. For the first time in exactly the right place. She was home, and this time she was going to stay.